Plans have been announced to overhaul the way people apply for asylum in the EU. The mass influx of refugees have put a strain on countries like Greece and Italy, which are on the front line of the crisis. Under the current scheme, refugees must apply for asylum in the first EU country that they arrive in. Now the European Commission is proposing to scrap this so-called Dublin regulation and introduce a mandatory redistribution system for asylum seekers. The alternative option would be to preserve the first country of entry principle, but to add a so-called corrective fairness mechanism. Well, the new rules will need to be agreed on by EU member states. Frans Timmermans, the European Commission First Vice President, says the current system has failed everyone involved.
We need to reform our common European asylum system. The current crisis has shown the present system is not working. The problem we need to fix is that the system relies largely on where a person first arrives at the EU to decide which member state should handle an asylum claim. This is neither fair nor sustainable given the reality of the volumes of people, which has put a huge burden on just a very few number of member states.
Let's get more with Simon McGregor-Wood, who joins me now from London. Simon, give us a bit more detail on these proposals that have been announced today, because how do they play into the current EU-Turkey plan to contain the refugee crisis?
Well, this is a long-term vision that needs a very short timetable if you can reconcile that difference. The Europeans realise that the present system simply isn't working. The so-called Dublin regulations were introduced back in the 90s, and they were designed to handle the numbers of people trying to get into the European Union back in those days. The model simply doesn't work now, and it hasn't worked actually for several years, because the system says that if you are a migrant or an asylum seeker arriving in Europe, whichever country you first set foot in recent years, of course, it's been Greece and Italy, to a lesser extent Spain, that's where you have to stay and process your asylum application. But the system has simply broken down because of the weight of numbers, and that is why these new proposals are being dreamt up. I say dreamt up because we're at the beginning of a very long and complicated process that depends on all 28 members of the European Union agreeing to some degree or another of a redistribution process, and that system hasn't worked very well so far.
Well, exactly, Simon. I mean, this entire discussion could be moot because, we've seen it over and over again. A lot of countries in Europe just don't want these refugees in their countries. So, what happens now?
Well, two big issues, you're right. The first issue is that this is the Commission thinking up ideas behind closed doors with consultation, sure, but it's the beginning of a very long political and diplomatic struggle. These are two ideas. They have to be approved by the heads of state of the European Union. I reckon there's at least 2 or 3 heads of state summits worth of disagreements over these issues before they can get a piece of paper that represents the final draft, and then it has to be approved by the European Parliament. So I think we're talking months and months rather than weeks. And yes, you're absolutely right. There has been really significant resistance, particularly in Central and Eastern European countries, to any system that seeks to impose mandatory redistribution. You remember in the heat of this crisis in 2015, the EU came up with a system to redistribute 160,000 refugees and asylum seekers throughout the European Union. To date, 1,000 of those, just 1,000 of those, have successfully been redistributed. So, nice ideas, putting them into practice, let's see.
OK, Simon, many thanks for that. Simon McGregor-Wood joining us there from London.